first section of the UN Charter that this organization is being created to save succeeding generations from scourge of war, to ensure the dignity of the human individual, and to ensure sovereign equality. The same documents then proceeds to give 5 nations the right to veto. Where is sovereign equality if 5 nations have the right to veto? So there are 2 movements in the world for democracy. One democracy inside the nations and one democracy among the nations. What we would like to see at the beginning of the 21st century, not only that Iraq should become democratic, but the US should also become democratic in terms of its relationship with the rest of the world. Now the issue of Iraq, I think is an interesting one. Because when Saddam Hussein, who was clearly a thug and a dictator, when he was ruling that country, less than 2% of the people of his country were involved with the governance of Iraq. When the Bush administration is ruling over that country, less than 2% of the people are involved with the governance of that country. As a matter of fact, and this is a favor that Rajiv Chandrasekharan, an Indian-American writer who writes for Washington Post, has done to all of us by writing a dispatch from Iraq. He said Brimmer brought a plan from Washington, gave it to Iraqi opposition and asked them to submit it back to him as their own. So the Brimmer plan, which was given to the Iraqi opposition to be resubmitted to the administrator, to the ruler, whose man it was to begin with, involved less than 2% of population in holding elections through a caucus system, where it was going to be the US occupying power that were going to decide the people, even the 2% who will participate. It was Imam Ali Sistani, the Shia Imam, supposedly a fundamentalist, who said, no, we want democracy, but we want the real democracy. We want 1 person, 1 vote. Who is teaching democracy to whom here? Again, it is not a fight with American ideals. It is the hypocrisy and dishonesty in maintaining those ideals. When it was Saddam Hussein ruling over the country, large contracts were given to his friends and his cronies in a non-bid contract process. When the Bush administration is ruling over Iraq, large contracts are being given in a non-bidding process to his friends and his cronies, including Halliburton, where the Vice President of the United States had a personal interest. When Saddam was ruling over that country, people were tortured in the prisons. We have heard about that. When Bush administration is ruling over that country, people are being tortured in the prisons. When Saddam ruled over that country, the rich and the elites stayed in the palaces. When US administration is ruling over that country, US troops are staying in the same palaces. When Saddam was ruling over that country, knowledge production was controlled by the state, and it was decided by the state what will go into the book of history in describing different events and different historical narratives. When US is ruling over that country, knowledge production is controlled by the occupied power. Where is the sense of liberation for which Iraqi people should be so thankful? So I think what we are doing here is passing occupation as liberation. And we are expecting this liberation to yield the type of results that most occupied powers in world history have desired for, but almost always failed. Please remind yourself of Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay, who was the Brimmer of his day, a scholar and administrator. When he went to India, he wrote his famous Minutes on Indian Education, in which he said we must create a class of people in India who are Indian by ethnicity and blood, but European by taste and culture. How do you make people who are Indian by blood into European by taste and culture? He said through their education. And they changed their education system, they controlled it, they refocused it, and to some extent they got their desired result. But I believe the most coherent answer, almost directly addressed to that particular thesis, is given by French philosopher Sartre in his preface to Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth. If you look at Sartre's preface to Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth, he says, when we went to rule over these countries, we created a class of people that he calls puppets. We shall say the words, their mouths will open and the words will come out. He said then came a second class of people that he calls the Greco-Latin Negroes. The Greco-Latin Negro, he says, was the person who was well versed in the classics of Greece and Rome, who knew the literature, who knew art, who knew culture, who knew philosophy, who knew religion. and he could speak the master's idiom back to the master, as good as the master, sometimes even better. And the master was overjoyed. What have I created? He talks back to me and he will protest. He said, then came the third generation of people who were cultural schizophrenics. People who had made it, who had become the brown sahibs, who had the privilege, who were the elites, and yet their consciences were not totally at ease. They were always torn, they were always divided. And the fourth, he said, came a class of people who were revolutionaries. Now, because Fanon spoke of violence, and he had no problem with that, his conception of revolutionary usually is very quickly ignored or hidden and not paid attention to. And I think one man in this country 15, 20 years ago who brought the essence of that out was late Iqbal Ahmed in his famous essay, Radical But Wrong. And as you know, Iqbal had worked very closely with Fanon. But the point that Fanon was making that is different than carrying out violence was the revolutionary. Revolutionary was not necessarily who fought, who was better at fighting, who was better at out-organizing and out-propagandizing the enemy, who was able to reach to other sides better. And the example that I'll give you from that is, it will not be a person who actually walks into a trap and fights his way out of it. It is somebody who looks at a trap and says, are you kidding? And walks away from it. What we have in Iraq today is a resistance movement building up. Look at the language of the New York Times. It has started by calling them thugs and terrorists and Saddam loyalists and so on and so forth, all the usual cliches. But now occasionally it is becoming forced to call it insurgent movement, and Europe has started calling it resistance movement. I have yet to see a single coherent and serious analysis of the social composition of its resistance movement. Because a central fact has not been acknowledged and will not be acknowledged because it goes against the official grain. That is, we are committing an act of occupation. Occupation by itself is violence. When you occupy people against their will, you violate their souls. When people's souls are violated, they react in violent ways. That is a central point. What we see in Iraq today is an emerging coalition of working class, of the lumpen proletariat, of the middle classes, of the secular intelligentsia, and of the religious intelligentsia. Remind yourself, when was the last time that you saw the crystallization of these forces in such a short period of time? When US was occupying Vietnam, there was another superpower, namely Soviet Union on the other side, and China, and Korea, North Korea, that helped Vietnamese fight and seek their freedom. When Afghanistan was occupied by the Soviets, it was the United States and the NATO countries and the entire Middle East and Pakistan and Bangladesh and others who supported Afghans fight the Soviets and defeat them. Today there is not a single superpower or even a regional power on the other side. But have you noticed that Iraqi people have made the country practically ungovernable for the sole superpower in the world? The central fact there is the fact of occupation. We cannot force change on other people. What I think there is still time for the United States, and that is to hold elections, transfer power, and to live with dignity and honor. It will be making maybe short-term embarrassment, but that will be a long-term gain, because if Iraqi people at the end of the day do receive a democratic government that may be anti-US in the short period, they will still always remember it as a gift of democracy from the United States. But if the US is tempted to have democracy, but a pro-American democracy, we may end up spoiling what is possible within our reach. Thank you very much.
From Harvard Law School in 1959, joined the world's leading communications law firm Haley, Bader & Potts in Washington, D.C., and in 1962 entered the world of think tanks by co-founding the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University. During the ensuing 2 decades, he served as a personal advisor to U.S. presidents, cabinet officers, and congressional leaders, and co-authored, and edited more than a dozen books and scores of professional articles in the field of global strategy and futures forecasting. President Nixon appointed him Deputy Director of Planning in the National Security Council, and President Reagan appointed him U.S. Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, with unofficial duties to promote two-track diplomacy as a means of peaceful engagement with the peoples and leaders of the Muslim world. Dr. Crane founded the Center for Civilizational Renewal in 1992 and is presently active in the United Religions Initiative designed to develop a spiritual dimension in the global pursuit of peace through justice. He is active in developing the School of Islamic and Social Sciences, which was established in Leesburg, Virginia in 1996 to revive Islamic thought and infuse its wisdom into modern academia. There he is responsible for teaching a course on the American political system. His most recent articles can be found at the website theamericanmuslim.org. That's all one word, theamericanmuslim.org. And the most interesting fact about him, and he will give a little bit more about his biography and relationship with the Republican Party, but he is also perhaps the only person to have escaped a Soviet prison gulag twice. Dr. Crane.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And I'm also the associate of Anisa Abdul Fattah. We were the first two, I guess we were the only two employees of the Center for Public Policy Research, 8 years ago. So we go back a long way. I want to talk about justice, partly because President Bush has never once mentioned the word. As a lifelong Republican, I guess my role at this counter-convention is not to oppose the Democrats or to support third parties, although I do. My task is to represent the Republican Party by bringing out the best of republicanism in its vision of a global future based on justice. See, I consider that I belong to the loyal opposition. I think Muslims should be active in all parties to bring a higher understanding of reality and a vision of justice wherever they are, every country, every party. Since 9/11, particularly, the word justice has gone out of style in both of the major parties. Instead, America's best hope for the future is said to be, quote, freedom and democracy. This inspires Americans to action. Unfortunately, most of the people in the world cynically believe that the call for freedom and democracy is merely a slogan designed to mask a covert policy of preemptive imperialism. And to some extent that's right, to some extent it's not. But how can we overcome this problem where people perceive that whatever Americans do has a hidden meaning? And to some extent it does. America's detractors point to specific foreign policies that seem to be modeled on the pagan empires of the past. Robert Kagan wrote a book about 3 years ago, which is required reading in the White House, called Pagan Empire, something about the need for a pagan empire, which means that we should follow the example of past pagan empires. And he was basically articulating the theory of neoconservatism. Without the America's defenders defend this policy of the pagan empire because they say they're needed to bring stability to a world that threatens to collapse into a universal chaos. As a matter of fact, this same Robert Kagan spent a year with President Bush just before 9/11 telling him that his moral duty is to impose American power on the world because if he doesn't, the world would collapse into chaos. And this also is required reading in the White House. Their theory is that without the use of what is called hard power, such as the stick of unilateral military preemption, and soft power, which includes everything else, freedom and democracy, and indeed all civilization would end. So, in my view, both parties are basing their policies on a framework of fear, and they're also using that politically to support themselves. And there is, the world is lapsing into chaos. But you can't stamp out the chaos by military means. You have to address the causes of it. And this is where justice comes in.